That's a good start. So tonight we are looking at Acts chapter 15. Maybe a good starting point would be for someone to give me a page number. We'll come to the 889. So if you want to have that open at that point, you're welcome to look through that chapter as we discuss it. I don't know how your table discussion went with the question about personality types and conflict, but if it was anything like our table, the conversation would have been very entertaining, I think would be a good word. It's a big topic, isn't it? How we deal with conflict in our life. I found a new conflict resolution strategy at the beginning of this year. I joined a golf club. So if I have a particularly bad week, I stand on the first tee and I visualise all the people that have annoyed me and mentally paint their pictures on the golf ball before I hit it down the fairway. Unfortunately, I've noticed over the last few weeks that tends to cause an even worse opening shot than usual. Way too far. Yes, or way too far in the wrong direction. Yeah, but that's another story. Right, today's passage, as we said, is Acts 15, and I want to read just a couple of short segments from that chapter. You're welcome to browse through the rest of it as we go, if that helps. But to start with, I want to read, let's see, we've got a button on the screen, which I think is indicating, we need to clear that before we can go on to the next page. That's helpful, thank you. So the first one is Acts 15 and verses 1 and 2, which say this. While Paul and Barnabas were at Antioch of Syria, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers, unless you're circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. Finally, the church decided to send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem, accompanied by some local believers, to talk to the apostles and elders about this question. And then most of the chapter is a record of what was discussed and decided. And then we're going to jump to the next story, which is at the bookend of chapter 15, starting from verse 36. After some time, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let's go back and visit each city where we previously preached the word of the Lord, to see how the new believers are doing." Barnabas agreed and wanted to take along John Mark. But Paul disagreed strongly, since John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in their work. Their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, and as he left, the believers entrusted him to the Lord's gracious care. Then he travelled throughout Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches there. And the reality, of course, is that conflict is a huge part of our lives. It arises in so many different ways, doesn't it? We don't need to think very hard. Differences of opinion, different cultures, perceptions of justice and injustice, even simple greed and selfishness and revenge. And we have big pictures like the war between Russia and Ukraine at the moment, or maybe personal stories which are a lot smaller but just as potent. Domestic violence or a family in crisis, arguments over COVID restrictions, unfair work practices, and the list goes on. And we've got to be honest that the church is not immune from that. We are not immune. Church is simply you and me doing life together. And so the themes that cause conflict elsewhere in the world and in our lives are just as likely to cause conflict inside the church. So it's good for us to think about this and to be honest, and perhaps ask ourselves, what are some ways in which we can learn and grow in the area of dealing with conflict and promoting peace? This whole chapter can be described as two stories of conflict. The first story is a conflict about truth. Initially, the church was made up of Jews, but over time its membership grew and expanded, and soon non-Jews were signing up for this Jesus movement. And the big question became, what actually does it mean with all these diverse cultures and groups coming in to be a Christian? And some people thought that these non-Jews needed to be circumcised, because after all, every Jew initially was circumcised. In other words, in their mind, to become a Christian, you first of all had to become Jewish. And other people, particularly focusing on Paul and Barnabas in this chapter, they disagreed, and the word there is vehemently, they disagreed. Imagine that, a disagreement in the church. And most of this chapter describes the leadership conference that this new church held to wrestle with and to sort out this burning question. The second story that we've got here is a conflict about a person. So it's very much a relational one-off event here between Paul and Barnabas themselves. And following on from the conference, they decide to set out on their second missionary journey. And the question they face is, who should come with us? Because they wanted it to be a team mission. Barnabas suggests John Mark, and Paul says no for reasons that we'll explore. And the two of them get into such a fiery debate that they themselves are split apart and go their separate ways. So what does all this mean? Well, the first and simplest and most obvious thing it means is that we shouldn't be surprised when we encounter conflict. The reality is, and if we think about another big word that we face in life, our response to suffering, if we think about the way in which the Bible deals with suffering, it doesn't actually spend a lot of time talking about the why of suffering. Why are these bad things happening to me? But it spends a lot of time preparing us to respond. How do we live and respond well to the suffering that we find in life? And so the first thing that happens is that Jesus and the New Testament writers remind us of the reality of suffering so that we can prepare for it. Jesus himself says to his disciples, in this world you will have suffering. Can't get more direct than that. And Peter, taking that cue from his master in one of his letters, says this, dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice since you're participating in the sufferings of Jesus Christ. There's a picture here that when we have tough situations in our life, the starting point is this is a reality that we should expect and we should prepare for. And it's the same with conflict. We should expect it. We should understand, first of all, how big and important and complex life is, just as life. And people are important and complex and multifaceted, and they're passionate about the life that we all share. So of course, even in the best of situations, putting aside all the problems that we have from our brokenness and selfishness and other reasons which add to the conflict, even in good situations, there's going to be conflict because it's a big world that we live in. Simply because these issues and this life that we live in, it matters to us, it's important. When I described a few moments ago the conflict stories as a conflict about truth and a conflict about a person, that can look very dry and academic and bullet pointy. So let's add another word to the mix. Conflicts of the heart. We see that from the words that Luke uses to describe the conflict. And in the first story, I bring up phrases that are involved. some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers, unless you're circumcised, you cannot be saved. Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently. In that story, the word that's used is a word that appears twice more in Acts. And in the other two occasions, it's a word that Luke uses to describe the situation when Paul, later in the book of Acts, is in Jerusalem and he goes into the temple in Jerusalem to make a sacrifice. And what happens is that some of the other Jews that are in the temple at that time think he's brought a Gentile into the Holy of Holies. And they are so angry at this breach of the most fundamental part of their Jewish life that a riot is started. That's the word that's used here in this story. This is an issue that's so important to Paul and Barnabas that when these other Jewish people dare to suggest that Gentiles need to be circumcised, they riot against the very idea that's going on here. This is not just academic. This is deep down. This is something that has touched a chord deep in their hearts. Story 2, different word, but no less emotional. We get the phrase there, their disagreement was so sharp that they separated. And the word that's used there in the Greek is a word that we have in English as well. It's the word paroxysm. And it's used as a word that describes a strong feeling or expression of emotion that simply cannot be controlled. In medical terms, it's used to describe the shaking that you get from an epileptic fit. That's how strong we're talking about here. These are not shallow conflicts. They're windows into two disputes that touched Paul and Barnabas at the very core of their being. So the first thing is, in some cases, it's entirely appropriate that we should experience conflict in our lives. You could put it the other way around. What kind of life is it that I'm living if nothing touches me deeply enough to want to challenge an opposing viewpoint? That's effectively saying that life doesn't really matter at all. How tragic would that be? However, the other side of the equation looks something like this. There are still potentially good and bad responses to conflict. So even if conflict is natural and understandable, it doesn't follow that every response that we might make is a good response. And again, that's illustrated in our two stories here. There's a little bit of reading between the lines that you might need to imagine, but for me, story 1 shows a healthier way of responding, and story 2 is far less healthy. And it's good, again, it's a good, honest representation of where we are in life. So story 1, for instance, we have people debating an issue. And as part of the process that goes on, we have an organized conference where the whole church talks about the issue. And although we don't have all the viewpoints listed out in full detail, we have a hint that even people who had views opposed to Paul and Barnabas got their opportunity to say what they thought on the matter. It's about the whole church communicating. It's about the whole church listening. It's about everyone who has a heart on the subject getting to speak and to be heard. So voices are expressed. The discussion is wide-ranging as well. The issue is considered from different angles. For instance, they would ask themselves, what do we learn from the stories of God at work through us? What a great question that is. And so they had stories about Paul and Barnabas and what happened to them on their missionary trip. They had the story of Peter and the conversion of Cornelius and his household, and they're reflecting on what God is doing in their midst. There's also a reflection on what do we learn from Scripture. And so James takes a passage which is important to him, which talks about the way in which God is bringing the Gentiles in the fullness of time into the family of God. There's a question that they ask, what is the Spirit saying to us? Trying to listen to what God is actually speaking to me in this moment. And finally, they make an effort to balance the different situations of different groups in the church. So they reach a decision and they circulate it in a written letter to all the churches. And in essence, the letter affirms the place of Gentiles in the church by grace. Nothing else is required. No rule that says you have to become Jewish first. And yet, they still ask the Gentile churches to abide by certain Jewish rules and regulations, such as avoiding meat, eating meat that's been offered to idols. And we know from some of Paul's correspondence, like the letter to the Corinthian church, how big an issue and how hard an issue that was to resolve, with two completely different groups coming together with different ideas. And so you get a strong sense that the leaders are saying here, you don't have to do this or that thing, that ritual over there or that activity there. You don't have to do that first to become a Christian. You just become a Christian. It's just Jesus. It's just grace. And that's a wonderful thing to remember for all of us. But you can still choose out of love to adopt some of those rituals for the purpose of not offending other people. So in all of these ways, there are beautiful pictures of how we can choose to deal with conflict situations positively and work to maintain unity and harmony and love and grace in our church fellowship. But then we turn to story 2, which can be summed up in one sentence. Their conflict was so explosive that all they could do was go their separate ways. I have read accounts of this story which try to twist it positively. For instance, maybe this was really God's way of creating 2 missions instead of 1. So Barnabas went in one direction and Paul went in the other, and they've involved other people, and everything's much better than it would have been otherwise. Maybe God just had different plans for Paul and Barnabas. After all, doesn't the Bible tell us that in all things God works for good of those who love him? And it's certainly true that we can imagine good outcomes from an incident like this. But my response when I think about that is, even if God can work something good out of a bad event, it's still a bad event. I may preach a lousy sermon and God in his mercy may bless someone and touch their spirits. I shouldn't take that as permission to preach a lousy sermon the following Sunday. Also, with a bit of imagination, we can understand why this incident became so explosive. We can work to understand the story from both sides. For example, this is a classic picture of personality types. Barnabas was very much a people person, a relational person. His very nickname in the church was Son of Encouragement. He was generous with his material possessions, selling property to give money to the poor. He was the key person who accepted Paul after Paul's conversion, because every other leader in the infant church wouldn't touch Paul with a barge pole because of his violent past and his reputation. And I think that's an ironic background given the situation that we will come to here with this conflict between them. Paul, on the other hand, comes across as very mission-oriented. He focuses time and time again on his calling as an apostle and the work that God has called him to. And he's the kind of person who can write, for instance, words like this at the start of one of his church letters in Galatians. Let me repeat what I've just said. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse. Let them be anathema. The following sentence, just in case you missed the point. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. And so when the question arises of including Mark in their new mission, it's no wonder they were divided. The problem was that Mark had been with them on the previous mission, and it's completely failed. He'd let them down by abandoning them because it was presumably just too hard for him, and he returned home halfway through missionary trip number 1. So how do they respond? Well, Barnabas was the people person, so he was still supportive of this person who was immature, who had failed, who'd given up, just as he'd been supportive of Paul himself. That's how Barnabas was wired. Give the guy another chance. On the other hand, Paul, the mission-oriented person, equally understandable, he's interested in the people who will best do the work. And based on previous performance, that obviously wasn't going to be Mark. But for me, and maybe this is my personality type showing through, it's precisely because I can see both sides of the story that I feel so deeply the tragedy of the way it played out. I wish so much that it could have been handled in the light of these words that Paul himself wrote later in the book of Ephesians. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit. Just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And that's our calling too, isn't it? Take a few moments to consider those words. Words that call us to be humble, putting other people's interests ahead of our own. Words that call us to be gentle. In our readings today, the disagreements are described as sharp. If you want to understand what gentle is, treat gentle and sharp as opposites. We're called to be patient, willing to give as much time and energy as is needed to promote peace, as long as it takes. We're called to bear with each other, recognizing that none of us is perfect. Therefore, we should avoid being judgmental when other people get it wrong. And we should uphold those among us who trip up when they trip up. And all of this is to be done out of the love that God himself has poured into our hearts. And we should give all our energy to maintaining the unity which God's Spirit has generously and graciously given to us. Why should we do this? Because as Paul says, there is only one church, one body, one family, one worshipping community. We are all in the same boat, and we need to protect the seaworthiness of the boat that we sail in. It's a big challenge. It's a challenge, of course, which at a human level is impossible. which is why we need to hang on tightly to the grace of God as we do our best to maintain peace and work to heal conflict relationships among us. Let's have a look at a question. Very simple. We're just going to take a sentence out of the verses that we've just looked at. Paul says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Take a few moments to reflect on that verse and ask yourselves as a table, what does that sentence mean to us? And perhaps what are some of the ways that we could put that into practice in our church and personal lives? Over to you.